The one thing I love about being a reptile owner is getting to own all sorts of exotic and bizarre lizards, snakes, and so on from all across the globe. I bought my first one back in high school, a female bearded dragon I had named Sue, loosely after the famous T-Rex on display at the Chicago Field Museum. Ever since, it has been my passion to own reptiles and amphibians, and I've been collecting different species from various stores and suppliers for years now. Though, not to gloat, I myself own a whole personal menagerie, 10 species of snakes, 15 lizards, 5 freshwater turtles, 20 tropical frogs, 14 salamanders and newts, and a sulcata tortoise. I had worked at several pet stores in my time owning reptiles, many of which sold threatened or even endangered species of reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds. Some of these species I saw were so rare, at times I questioned if it was even legal to sell them in the first place. However, the most recent store, the one I previously worked at, sells species that, had I not gotten the opportunity to see with my own eyes, I would have never believed. The information I'm about to disclose here may seem like a wild fantasy, but dang it, people need to know about what I saw. It all began about 5 months ago, when I had just finished relocating. It was quite the hassle to move all my animals to my new apartment, regardless of having several friends help out with the move. Nonetheless, after dealing with all of that, I started looking for a new job, and one of the first results I came across was an exotic pet store. I knew right away that was my go-to. Within the course of a week, I had applied for a job position, and I was able to get the position that I wanted, working in the reptile department. On my first day, I had walked into the store and was met with what was apparently the equivalent to a miniature zoo. Up front, there is a large cage with fruit bats hanging from a perch in it. Next to the cage was a rope platform, and a small anteater hanging from those ropes. In addition to being surprised, I was admittedly impressed by the collection the store had to offer. They sure are something, huh? I turned to see a casually dressed man standing to the left. It didn't take me long to realize it was the store manager. "You the new guy?" he asked. "Yeah, that would be me," I replied. My name's Josh. I was the one who applied for the reptile section." "I see. You are in for quite a treat, Josh. Name's Keith, by the way." After his introduction, I noticed Keith carrying what appeared to be a rock in his right arm. Upon further inspection, I realized it was a fossil, one of 2 trilobites side by side. "Paradoxides Davidus, right?" I asked. I see you know your stuff," he replied. "You see, in addition from my love of reptiles, another interest I've had for a long time is paleontology. When I was young, dinosaurs and other extinct animals had always caught my attention, and I'd even started a small fossil collection, one that I still have at home to this day. Though it isn't as grand as what I have with my animals, regardless, I was fascinated. Keith showed me a closer look at the trilobite fossil, letting me see just how well preserved they were. "It's interesting to think the kinds of animals there were back then," Keith said. "In fact, 99.9% of everything that existed on this planet is extinct, and we only occupy a tiny sliver of all that history." It looked like Keith was into paleontology and fossils, much like me. My real interest, though, was with the reptiles that they had. "About the reptiles section that you have here, can you show me where it is?" I asked Keith. "Sure thing, right this way." Upon entering the reptile department, I was amazed by what they had. Legit venomous snakes, vipers, cobras, hognoses, and even an inland taipan, one of the deadliest species known. This section also featured poison dart frogs from South America that, while cute, contained enough poison to kill 10 humans. The highlight were 2 large tanks, one with a white alligator, the other with 2 dwarf caimans. "You sure seem happy," he said. "I think you'll do quite nicely here. But as for me, I gotta head out." "Alright," I replied. "Anything else I should know about?" "Yeah, be careful out there," Keith said. Afterwards, Keith laughed. I wondered what he meant by that. Regardless, I went about the day doing my job. Later in the evening, towards the end of my shift, I decided to see what other kinds of animals were around that the store had to offer. Many mammals you wouldn't expect to be kept as pets, like kangaroos and small monkeys, were put on display. There was an array of interesting birds as well, from typical macaws and cockatoos to even toucans. The fish department had all sorts of tropical fish, one of which was an electric eel, which, believe it or not, is kept by some people in private collections and handled with specialized gear. However, past the fish section at the back of the store, there was an elevator door. My first thought was that it probably led to a storage room, but then to the left of the doors it read a sign: Historic Department. Authorized personnel only. Historic Department. I spent a few minutes contemplating what it meant by a historic department. I wasn't sure if I myself was permitted to go down, but unable to put my finger on what it could be, I decided that I may as well go find out and see for myself. I got into the elevator and selected the lower level. The ride down took several minutes, despite the destination being the only other floor in the building. When the doors finally opened, I walked out to see a colorful array of different terrariums. From a distance, I wasn't sure what kind of animals were inside, but as I went to take a closer look, that's when things started to get weird. Upon the first terrarium that I peeked at, inside was a bizarre-looking lizard. Its body resembled some sort of a knoll or gecko. The only difference, there were long, feather-like quills coming out of its back. And then I realized what it was. Holy crap. The animal inside was a prehistoric reptile known as the Longisquama, a reptile from the Triassic period. But what the heck was a reptile that's been extinct for 335 million years doing in an exotic pet store? And more importantly, how? Apparently that wasn't all. Another terrarium contained a Diplocaulus, a Permian amphibian with a boomerang-shaped head. Several reptiles and amphibians supposedly extinct for millions of years were all being contained beneath the pet store. I attempted to rationalize what I had been seeing, but no matter what I came up with, nothing could properly explain what I was seeing. Without a doubt, these were living, breathing animals that haven't been seen in eons. My first question, though, is how? Where did they all come from, and how did the store receive them? Wanting to find out, I decided to take a look around the floor, which was seemingly larger than the actual shop on the top, the size of a large hardware store. The first section I decided to explore was the aquarium section. Instantly, I recognized several organisms. One large tank contains an Anomalocaris, a primitive shrimp-like arthropod from the Cambrian. It was about 3 feet long and the earliest known apex carnivore. I watched as it swam gracefully around its tank, with its round insectoid eyes. Some of the other tanks included some primitive jawed fishes as well as some of the earliest species of sharks known to exist. The largest tank in the section was the size of something you would see in a marine park, though in it swam a medium-sized fish, adorned with armored plating. All this for something of that size. And then something massive bolted right out from underneath it like a freight train, snapping it up in its jaws. the shock of which made me jump back. I soon realized that the fish was just food, and that the real animal being contained was the massive Devonian fish, Dunkelostis. Whoever thinks that keeping a 4-ton predator Devonian fish as a pet is a good idea, I feel genuine concern for. And more importantly, in addition to how all these seemingly extinct animals got here, I began to wonder who they were being sold to. Soon after, I wandered into a section under the title Avians, like birds. As I walked into the section, the first thing I noticed was a grayish-looking bird-like animal with black wingtips, only it had a long tail, fingers underneath its wings, and teeth. Instantly, I recognized it as the primitive avian, Archaeopteryx. Several other primitive Mesozoic birds were also showcased in this section. When observed, it's easy to see how modern birds themselves are linked to dinosaurs. Past that section, there was a room with the label, Unprocessed Assets. Not sure what that meant. I walked into the room and saw not living animals but fossils, much like the one Keith had earlier. But what was the point of all these? What was a collection of fossils doing in an area with living, breathing, prehistoric animals? It didn't make any sense. I knew you were curious, boy, but this is a bit much now. I turned to see Keith standing in the doorway of the fossil room. Keith, I replied, what is all of this? Where did these animals come from? Who are you selling them to? Keith just stood there, his perplexed expression slowly turned into a smile. Josh, my boy, all this around you is the product of some of the most brilliant minds and advanced science you'll have ever seen. Keith then grabbed a fossil of a hawk-sized dragonfly, presumably a Meganura. Come on, I'm gonna show you how it was all made. Keith then led me back through the avian section, across the hall to a room titled Processing. In the room, there is a large, kiln-like device in it, surrounded by 4 Tesla coils. This is it, boy. This here's the room where it all happens. Where what happens? I asked. Keith stood there and smiled for a second. You see, my business was always about selling exotic animals from different places. I'd always been supplied with just about every animal up on the top floor, but new laws and regulations started coming in. I wasn't able to supply myself with the kind of animals I usually sold as often as I was used to. But then, that's when I got my hands on this thing. Exactly what does that thing do? I hesitantly asked. Well, allow me to show you. Keith then walked over to the machine with the fossil in his arm and he opened the hatch. Gently, he placed the fossil inside the machine. Step back a bit, boy, this'll be a bit hazardous, Keith said. Keith then closed the hatch and guided me over to a control panel with several buttons and a switch. He looked over to me with an unsettling smirk on his face. Time to fire her up. Keith then pressed a large gray button, powering on the Tesla coils. I could hear the electricity powering up as the machine in the middle began to rev up. The sounds of the machine began to grow louder as it was powering on. At the peak of the machine's full power, Keith then pulled the level down, resulting in an ear-piercing shock. The machine had completely powered down, and for a minute, everything was silent. And then out of nowhere, a loud buzzing sound started to come from in the machine. Keith seemed to be pleased with this. Ah, well there you have it, Josh. Out of the machine came a living Meganura that Keith held up by the abdomen. I tried desperately to wrap my head around what I had just witnessed. But how is this even possible? Keith replied, well, advanced science, that's how. Had some interesting connections on this fancy tech. He explained while putting the dragonfly into a spare cage beside the machine. That's not all though. Tons of folks on the dark web are willing to pay big money for these animals. More so than anything I've ever sold before them. Listening to him say all this, part of felt that something about doing all this seemed very risky and wrong. You just sell these animals, ones no human has seen alive, and just expect people to buy them and stay quiet about this. Keith chuckled. It's pretty brave assuming I just sell them to ordinary rich folk. I could only assume what he meant by that. Whoever he was selling to and for what purpose seemed like a terrifying thought. And what about me? How do you expect me to go on knowing about this? But Keith stopped me suddenly. What the heck says you're walking out of here? His response had taken me by surprise. What do you mean? Keith started to smile again. You actually thought I was going to let you walk out of here knowing all about this. I can't have you telling the wrong people about my business. My heart started to race. What are you talking about? I shouted. I knew immediately that I was in danger. Before I could run though, Keith had grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and pushed a cloth against my nose. I tried to struggle free, but I began to feel drowsy. It's a mighty shame, Keith said. I really did see some potential in you, boy. But you can't have an omelet without cracking a few eggs, I suppose. As I lost consciousness, I lost my strength. Soon, I was out completely. When I woke up, I was slowly able to regain consciousness. Once I was fully conscious, I noticed my hands and feet were tied up, and I was on my knees at the top of a deep rock pit with presumably a deeper pool. Before I could do anything though, a hand touched my shoulder and it was Keith. Easy now, Josh. Not much you can do at this point. I looked at Keith, angry and terrified. Why the heck are you doing this? I asked. Keith replied, all this down here, nobody's save for yours truly is supposed to know about. You think I just let normal employees work around here? I was gonna do this the dirty way, but where's the fun in that? I figured I would have Rebecca do it. Keith then shifted his attention to the massive pit I was positioned at the edge of. It didn't take me long to figure out what he had intended to do with me, as whatever was kept down there was massive. I do apologize, boy. I really hate to do this, but then again, it's just business. Keith then pushed me into the pit. As I fell down though, I was able to get a hold of one of the sharp rocks on the walls of the pit. I was able to maintain a tight grip, and while doing so, I pulled the ropes binding my hands against some rocks to get it off. As I was doing it though, this knocked some smaller rocks into the pool. Don't bother, Josh, you ain't leaving this place, Keith commented as I struggled. I ignored Keith as I continued to get my hands freed. As I was almost there, I looked down and noticed the water beginning to ripple. Out of the water rose two eyes with a jagged toothed snout below. I was able to finally get my hands free as I tightened my grip on the wall. When I looked down, there it was. I was able to recognize the creature as the giant prehistoric crocodilian. How Keith was able to resurrect massive animals such as that from simple fossil remains was beyond me, but I was more concerned with escaping with my life. And despite my feet being tied up, it wasn't as tight as it was with my hands, and as I started to climb up, I managed to loosen it more and more, and I was able to make my way up more efficiently. The massive croc bellowed at the bottom of the pit, waiting for me to lose my grip and fall down into its hungry jaws. I started to climb faster, until I was 2 feet away from the top of the pit. But when I put my right hand on the edge, Keith was there with his foot raised. Y'all just don't know when to quit. His foot came down, but before he could knock me off, I grabbed the ledge with my left hand, moved my right, and used it to grab Keith's leg. I gripped it so hard that it sent Keith forward, falling down into the pit past me. When I finally got out of the pit, I heard the splash. I turned to see the croc with Keith in its jaws, violently thrashing him around. It then submerged with Keith, and the last thing I saw were bubbles floating to the surface of the water. Afterwards, I decided to make a break for it. I ran as fast as I could through the floor, first past the avian section, Then the aquarium section past all the bizarre-looking marine animals that I saw. Finally, there was the elevator door. I bolted to it past the geraniums and called for the elevator. As soon as I was back on the first floor, I took a minute to get a hold of myself. I was well out of the job, while with the manager being dead and all. As I walked to the front of the store, I noticed it was nighttime. Seemed that I was down there longer than I had thought. I nervously walked out of the store and went home. A week later, I decided to relocate once more to find another job. Once again, going through the trouble of moving my reptiles and everything else. However, I've still wondered what became of everything that I saw, of those supposedly extinct animals that Keith was raising from the dead. Keith may be gone, but he mentioned several things about having contacts with certain people. I've still wondered just who those people are, as well as their reasons for purchasing those animals. What, if anything, do those people plan to do with those animals, and why? Regardless, the thought of it alone is quite unsettling when I think about it. Another thought I've been having is, how did Keith get that technology? Who did he get it from? And whoever made that tech and how? To this day, I am still not certain. But I have a feeling that one day, the truth of it will all be revealed. For better or for worse.